All right, so this is just to round out what we were talking about last time, this business with how Ajax works with the JSF infrastructure. Okay, so just a little review. You remember what Ajax was about, and the question is, why did people come up with it? And basically, prior to the concept of using those technologies together in the form of Ajax, the updates were, as it says here, coarse-grained. That is, you had to do entire page loads in order to do an update. Another thing is, you had to wait while the changes were being propagated through the page and then the entire page redisplayed. So essentially, that's like a synchronous process. So something that could give us an asynchronous mechanism was a big win, because then you could continue on doing other things. That makes the system seem much more interactive than it had been. And the third thing is the GUI widgets themselves. They're much better now, and particularly in the case of something like prime faces, there's quite a bit of enhancements. We're pretty limited. So the fact is, if you have something like an Ajax, then you can start to enhance the interactivity, enhance the whole user experience. So you still needed it to be browser-based. Obviously, that's the whole mechanism that all of our web applications are built on. So the question is, what could you do to help with those three problems and still allow them to use what they had in their browser, or what the browser in general provides? There were other attempts, just to remind you or mention it, that people had in order to try to solve some of these problems. The first one was built into the browser concept from the very beginning. That's the idea of Java applets. And applets were actually little pieces of Java code that ran in a sandbox in a virtual machine or something like that inside of each browser. Okay, and we still have that lingering around. There are still applets out there. However, the capability of running Java inside of a browser is disappearing. You probably have noticed over the past year or so that the latest releases of Chrome, Firefox, etc., have dropped what's called the NSAPI interface. That is the thing that supports Java code loading like that. So this was a nice idea, but people ultimately, it fell out of favor for several reasons, but one of the most important is that there are security implications that are very difficult or almost impossible to get around. Another alternative, which I'm sure you may be familiar with, is this Adobe Flash. Adobe being a separate company, and they invented a similar kind of plugin, in this case, to everybody's browser, called Flash, or the Flex is another version of it. And the idea there was to do applets right, okay? And there's a lot of code out there, a lot of sites that bought into this, okay? However, it's not ubiquitous, and in fact, Adobe, and for example, Apple, in the form of Steve Jobs, hated it. So it never was going to become part of an Apple infrastructure. So no Safari, no iPhones, no iPads, nothing like that. So that basically meant it was dead. And it's still lingering. And it doesn't mean it wasn't an interesting, useful technology, but people, and him in particular, really didn't like it, and because of that, it's sort of disappeared. There are other alternatives you might be familiar with. Microsoft Silverlight, that was another possibility. That only runs or ran on versions of Internet Explorer, however, and Java FX, which is a flavor of building Java-based UIs. That's a sort of a successor to Swing and that kind of AWT environment. So all of those, none of those really have taken off, and some of them are actually dying. So this is one of the reasons Ajax came to be. So again, remember, Traditional, one request, response, request, response, whereas with the Ajax model, there's a frequent smaller updates. And again, there are examples I showed you, one of the most obvious being something like the Google homepage. The ability to do auto-completion the way it does it, obviously it can't be auto-completing locally, at least not in a generic sense. Within the client is obviously because all those sources of information are coming from the server side. So there had to be some capability. If you're going to do it on every keystroke, the ability to do frequent small updates is critical. So one of the questions is, now we're living in a Java EE JSF world here, is why would you implement Ajax concepts inside of JSF itself? So why would you even build a Java-specific Ajax library? It turns out that jQuery, Dojo, Prototype, Scriptaculous, Delicious, blah, 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 all have Ajax components in them already. So why invent a new one for JSF? Well, the specific reason for that is because it allows you to do less as a developer. If you're a JSF developer, it means that instead of you having to learn jQuery or something else and then somehow figure out how to mingle the two things together, in fact, the developers of JSF did that for you. So generally speaking, the widgets that you're used to now, the output text, input text, button, command button, link, et cetera, all have been what you would call Ajaxified underneath the covers, and you don't even necessarily know that. Now you can, of course, using F:\Ajax or the prime faces P:\Ajax version, which is an extension of the F Ajax. You can actually get into lower level Ajax calls if you want, but in fact you would never have to do that, and you could still have a fairly Ajaxified, much more responsive application just writing JSF code. And so in general then, you mostly don't have to write any JavaScript if you don't want to. Now, in fact, I say mostly because there's some cases where you still really want to be able to do that and hook the things together, but in generally speaking, you don't have to, and you can still get the benefit of a lot of this. On the server side, Ajax now knows about JSF manage beans, so you don't have to do that yourself on the other side either. Reading the form fields, passing parameters, setting the bean properties, etc., is now all automatic. So, and all, Ajax compatible. So you don't actually have to write the servlet, and that's what the faces servlet is it knows about these things, and so you don't have to. So a little bit, dig into the JSF extension for Ajax, which we call F:\Ajax, which is the namespace, obviously. So basically, in its simplest form, if you're going to use it specifically, then you would probably use something like this, where you embed it inside of one of the other UI components, like command button, and it would be referencing either what gets displayed or what should be displayed. And then what I mean by displayed is without a whole page refresh. That's the render command, and of course, as we'll see, the execute is what gets updated on the server, again, without an entire page refresh. So here is the simplest form of that. You push the button, maybe some action happens over on the server, but what Ajax is going to do is intercept that and then render just that particular ID, which could be anywhere else in the form. So the interpretation of what you see there is the button's pressed, goes to the server, run the action, compute the value of the element. In this case, the one that's going to be rendered, send that value back to the client, then replace that element in the DOM, because that's really what's going on here, right, with the new value. Okay, and that happens all underneath the covers. If you, just as an aside, if the value, the attribute computes a new result each time, then you don't even have to say the action. And what I mean by that is, normally speaking, if you have an action in there, you're having it do something on the server. However, if the something that gets done is actually part of the retrieval of the thing that gets rendered. Okay, and I'll show you an example of what I mean by this later. Then, in fact, you don't have to do the action, if you see what I mean. Okay, if there's business logic in the code that actually updates the value that's getting rendered, well, it's already getting updated. So you don't actually have to say updated and give me the result. You can say just give me the result which has updated itself before I get it. You see? So that's just something to think about. You don't necessarily always want to do that, but it can be done. The more generic form here has more attributes that are relevant. Of course, there's the render, the execute. Remember how this corresponds to the execute phases of the life cycle and the render phase, okay, of the 6-step life cycle of the JSF handling. And then we have a couple of other things. The event, which can be used as a trigger, and on event, which actually allows you to get inside the Ajax request itself and monitor it or do something based upon the steps that it has to go through in order to actually complete the call to the server side. And that's a little bit more arcane. I'll show you an example where something like that actually might be used. So that's a more general form. So the render and execute, we talked about that. Render says what is redisplayed. And then whatever that is, normally speaking, has to be inside the same form. And then execute, which is saying what gets processed on the server. Okay. And don't forget, if you use the prime faces version of this, then they don't use the terms render and execute. They use the terms update and process. Okay, but it's the same thing in that case. Then there's the event. Now in this case, the events are the JavaScript events and a couple of others. And basically what you do is to refer to those is in the JavaScript world, it's on key up, on load, on blur, on whatever. Okay, here you basically just drop the on, and that's the keyword that you use. But it's the same event. And then on event is saying that if that event happens, whatever else you do, call some local JavaScript that's written on the client and runs on the client side also. So what do you have to do to use this stuff? Obviously you have to declare that namespace. We usually call it F by convention. And then that's the same F that's used for other things like F select items, F param, F view, and a couple of other things. In this case, you also, even though it hasn't really been particularly necessary, well, you didn't have to do it, is instead of using head, you use head. Okay, and the reason for that is if you use Ajax, Ajax has to be able to find the head section in order to put scripts in it. And unless you use h:head, it doesn't know what the ID is. Remember, the IDs, unless you specify them, are getting made up automatically. They're getting generated automatically every time the page gets loaded. So that's the reason that you use head, h:head, which comes from the other namespace. And it's always a good idea anyway. Okay, so there's really no particular reason not to do that if you're writing JSF pages, facelets. Now, this is a useful, interesting thing to remember. If, for whatever reason, the JavaScript has been disabled, now this is probably not as relevant as it used to be. You know, there was a phase that people went through that they became extremely paranoid about cookies, about running JavaScript code, etc., applets, you know, all those things. Nowadays, and so because people can turn those things off, they can disable cookies and they can disable JavaScript execution. And it used to be that if you wanted to make sure your site was going to be used properly, you had to handle those cases. Now, nowadays, I'd have to say, and as we've talked about before, I would say in the last year to 2 years, you've probably noticed sites, maybe it just does it once, when you visit the site the first time or early on, it'll say, this site uses cookies. I just want to make sure you realize this and say, okay. Or it can say the same thing with JavaScript. So I think, largely speaking, developers have come to the conclusion, look, if I'm going to write useful, interesting applications for my users, they're going to just have to use JavaScript and cookies to make it, work better. Okay. So, however, if for whatever reason the JavaScript is disabled, the nice thing about using this in JSF and this Ajax library is that the Ajax buttons, which depend, remember that's the J in Ajax, depend on JavaScript being there, they will still work. In other words, your site won't break. But basically what will happen is it'll fall back into doing full page refresh mode, okay? Which may not be the best thing, but at least it's not broken either, okay? So here's the adding the F, using the head, okay? So now you remember the idea of the action. Now this is the server side bean here. Generally speaking, the action in like a command button or a link, command link, the action is often designed to, in a non-Ajax form, is designed to return a navigation string. Okay? So generally speaking, that's what we're assuming is that in the non-Ajax form, it's going to return something that, normally speaking, the system can then interpret as where to go next. Okay? However, in the Ajax form of this, instead of making that assumption, basically your methods should usually return null. Now, what I'm saying is that it should specifically say return null, not just return or return something else. Because what will happen is if you follow that convention, then the page, this is the other half of this, the page will behave normally even if JavaScript is disabled. Okay? So the return value in an Ajax or an Ajaxified version is going to ignore that. So you have to make sure you return null, and so it won't be interpreted, even if Ajax is not working properly, it won't be interpreted as a navigation. Okay? That's just an aside there. Okay, let's look at render a little bit. Okay, so render basically says it takes either an ID or a space separated list of IDs on that page, and those are the things that are you're saying update these things with this call. They have to be in the same form as the F:\Ajax also. So details, besides those, we talked about this before, there are 4 special values, this, form, none, and all. Those are just shorthands. So for example, if you say form, it means every element in this particular form that I'm in at this point will get updated. Okay, if you say all, it means all the elements on all the forms will get updated. If it's this, it's just this particular element, okay? Which is, by the way, the default, which is why you don't actually have to say it if you don't want to, if that's what you're talking about. Also, another thing that you should remember is that instead of these rendered elements being just strings, they can be JSF EL expressions that return strings also. Okay, so it gives you a lot of flexibility on the server side to have server-side logic, which will then determine what gets updated by the call. Okay, so here's an example here of a command button. It has an action which is going to execute on the server, and it's referencing a second call to the server in the output text. Okay, so basically this is the non-Ajax form of this. Click the button, submit the form, the server does the update, it calls randomize, and then when it returns, it's going to send back the value of .number, that property, okay, or that method, whatever it happens to be, okay? So that's the standard way things have been working. And so what, you can't appreciate this by looking at it this way, but basically what's going to happen, here are three steps in this. The first time at the upper left there, if you press show number, it's actually going to do a full page reload. If you do it again, it'll do it again. You see how it's giving you different random numbers each time, okay? So that's the entire page being reloaded. Now, if you take the Ajax version of this, basically what you're going to say is do the same action except render the num field. Okay, so it's going to say you can get the same effect without having to reload everything else on the page. Okay, so you push the button, the JavaScript makes an Ajax call to the server, doesn't submit the form, it's asking to execute that and then to render the num field 1 ID, and then the server does that, inserts the value of number. It does a get number. Number would be one of the properties. It's actually calling get number there, and then actually inserting it into the DOM on the other side, so that when the browser redisplays it, it now has the new value in it. Okay, and again, the nice thing about this is that it will still work as long as you adhere to that returning, null thing, and etc. It will still work even if the JavaScript were turned off. So this is just the code on the other side, just to show you what's going on. So there's the call to randomize. Randomize is returning null. It's not returning the value, because what's happening is the number variable or property in the managed bean is getting updated, and get number will get that value which has now already been updated. So in this case, and again, unless you could run this, I can give you the code for all of this stuff too if you want. If every time you hit show number, what's going to happen is the screen won't flash or anything, just the field will get updated without making full calls. Okay. This is the variation I was telling you about. If in fact you, instead of calling the action, if in fact the thing that gets rendered actually as part of the retrieving the value, if in fact it's getting updated inside of that, okay, then in fact, if you think about it, then you don't need to call the action first. You simply you say, give me the latest value of whatever this is that's getting rendered, and inside of the code is not simply doing a retrieval, it's actually doing some business logic and then the retrieval once it's been set. Okay? There is, by the way, something to keep in mind with that is if for whatever reason this getter is called more than once in the page, all right, which would happen perhaps if you are in a UI repeat loop or something like that, or inside of a data table, then you might not want to do this, because what it's going to do is it's going to force the calls to do that execution again and again and again and again, instead of doing the execution once, which may be performance-wise more overhead, and to do the retrieval is cheap. To do the execution could be expensive, if you understand what I mean. So that's the alternative there. So in this case, there's no action. We just do the render, and the difference is, if you look here, what's going on, the getNumber2 version of getNumber is actually computing the random number inside of itself, instead of simply returning the value of the number2 property. Okay? So, but in fact, it works just fine, okay, in a case like this. So, something to keep in mind. Execute. Which elements get processed on the server? So this is the other side of render and execute. So here, Execute, it takes the same idea, an ID or a list of IDs, or an EL expression, and looks for those IDs inside the page. Okay? So again, there are these 4 values, this, form, none, and all, which I've explained already. You can use those. It's just convenience. For example, the form is quite convenient. If you know that you're really updating everything on the form, then instead of having to specify every single ID there, you can just simply say @form, and all of them will get executed or rendered. So here's an example of the same idea, except with an execute. So here you notice the things in red are the execute and then the ID that it's referring to. So what's happening here is, this is slightly different. It's similar to what you just saw, but if you look at it closely, there's an input text widget there, and it is actually looking it accepts a number range. Because of the way random numbers are generated, they're usually generated between 0 and n. And by default, if you say nothing, the standard random method in Java will return a number between 0 and 1. However, if you really wanted a number between 0 and 100, then you can specify that in the Java call. That's actually what this is doing here. So it allows you to, instead of simply getting one of those numbers between 0 and 1, you can say, I want, specify a particular range, an upper bound. So what's happening here, if you look at it closely, is that you're going to type in a value into range field, and once you hit the button, what's going to happen is it's saying whatever is associated with that ID, which is now the input text, is actually going to be sent to the server side. Okay? While you're typing it in, the server isn't seeing it. You understand? Okay? The server will only see it because it's getting executed. Okay? And the execute will force the server to actually do the set of range. Okay? And then you say render. In this case, it says, okay, I push the button, execute that guy, which updates the value, and then render this other thing, which shows me the result. Okay? So that shows you how execute and render work together. Okay? So in this case, this is we added this range property, so there's a set range. The input text widget where range is being referenced is actually what's causing this to actually execute on the server side. And it's only when you do that it's updating the value of range, which then, of course, when you say render the other thing, that's when it gets pulled out from the server and updating the UI element on the page. So in this case, what happens is if you type in 100 and say show number, then you get a number between 0 and 100. If you type in 1,000, say show number, you'll get a number between 0 and 1,000. Okay? And again, unless you saw this executing, you might say, so what? But in fact, the thing is that this is all happening without the entire page being refreshed. So, and that's an important difference, okay, in terms of how responsive the thing is. If you say execute form, that is an example. It says send all the elements of the form to process. It processes them all. So in effect, it's almost like a submit, if you think about it. And it's convenient, and if you don't want to list every single ID, but you want to have all of them render, so you don't need the explicit IDs in that case. So here's an example of that sort of thing. And here we've got a customer ID and a password, and then the command button has an action to say show balance, and the execute says, okay, all of the widgets on the inside the form should be sent to the server and executed, which in fact it does, and what's going to get rendered is this output text, which is at the bottom there. Okay, so again, instead of having to know which, that the first one is called, actually it doesn't even have an ID, so you don't even have to specify it. But otherwise you'd have to specify your own specific ID and then reference it. So here you don't even have to worry about that. Okay, and so on this side, the bean has a couple of things in it. There's a message that you're going to get and set. And here is the actual business logic here. This is what gets called by the action when you execute it. And the message also gets updated, and that will also go back to the other side. Okay? And the point is here that these things are getting automatically called, again, because the execute of @form was grabbing them all and telling the server, I want this one, set that one, et cetera, without you having to say it. So in this case, what happens is if you look at the top one there, it's expecting a customer ID and a password. If you put those two things and say show current balance, if it's not correct, as in the bottom right-hand corner, it would say unknown customer. That's the message that's coming back. Otherwise, it would give you the correct value. Okay? All right, the event attribute. Okay? Again, event is another attribute of Ajax. It's those JavaScript events minus the on. And then, as I said, there are also a couple more there too. But basically, that's the what this is referring to here. Okay. There are also JSF adds two other useful events called action and value change. And I'll show you that. Now, another thing, I don't think I have an example in here, but that's also useful. There's another kind of syntax. What we've been seeing so far is you've got a widget, and then inside the widget you say F:\Ajax. You can do it the other way around too. You can say F:\Ajax and then put a bunch of widgets inside of it and then say /F:\Ajax around it. Okay, which is it Ajaxifies all of the things that are in between there. So it's sort of a shorthand for having to do it for each separate one. Okay, now that may not be what you want, but it's a convenient thing if that's the effect that you're looking for. The action is part of JSF. It's not this event. It's not a part of the JavaScript, and it means it's been invoked in some way, shape, or form. So it's kind of like a generic. In other words, you don't have to look for on click or on the keyboard press or whatever. It's just that this has been essentially like submitted. So it's a convenience. This other one, value change, simply says that the value has changed. And because it turns out that underneath the browsers handle this differently, it's a real pain in the butt to get this right. So JSF has added this as a generic thing so that you don't have to worry about which browser this is and how does it handle looking for changes in value. And then this thing, the only thing you have to notice is that it's value big C as opposed to value change. Whereas all the rest of the other DOM events, the JavaScript DOM events, are all lowercase. So here, now you say, okay, where do you use this? Why is this useful, all this stuff? Well, there are lots of reasons. Basically, to make the thing more responsive and not to lower the amount of overhead going back and forth between the client and the server. That's a big win when you're talking about lots and lots of users. So here's an example, though, of something you undoubtedly have run into, and you may have asked yourself, how did it do that? Okay, so what we're going to do is these are what you might call chained you can do this with various different things, but either chained combo boxes or chained menus or select menus. And the idea here is that many times you've got essentially a hierarchy of things. You say, I want to look for all these wines, okay? So you start out and say, red versus white versus sparkling, and at that level, then you've got other menus which might say, type or country or vintage or a grape or whatever. But each of those other things is based upon the choice that was first made, okay? So unless you pick a type of wine, let's say, then, picking a country of origin doesn't mean anything. You understand what I'm saying? So it's hierarchical in that sense. So that's something that you really do a lot. So I'll show you an easy example of this. So here is, we're going to use select one menu, which is a form of a combo box. And it's going to hold the list of states of the United States. When the user selects a state, another combo box is going to be populated with a list of cities that make sense for that particular state. Okay, up until that point, there is no list of cities in the other box because it doesn't know what state you're talking about. Okay, and then the third thing, you'll see how it works. Okay. So we're going to use select one menu. When the city is selected, the population for that city is displayed. So you see how this is this chaining idea here. If a new state is selected, the list of cities changes, and the population value is cleared. Okay, because that value doesn't mean anything anymore, and which city has been picked doesn't mean anything anymore either. So you've got to update those things properly. So how might you do this? Okay, if you use Ajax, you might do something like this. The state list, you'd say render the city list and the population. Those are in fact based upon the state list. The city list, you'd render the population, which is based upon the city list. And then on the server side, the manage bean, in order to, remember, because each one of these is considered a separate request, an HTTP request, so that it remembers, okay? You could either make it view scoped possibly, or conversation scoped if you want to be fancy about it, but session scoped will handle this easily. Meaning, in between these requests, don't forget what you just did, okay? So another thing that, because of the nature of how Ajax works, you might very well want to add what you could call like dummy values. You've probably seen this too. So in the state list, for example, the top of the list might say something like choose state. Okay, so that's the dummy value. And that is what allows you to tell whether the thing has actually been chosen. Okay? Because if it says that, then you know they haven't picked one of the things. The value change event is this is the way that's the default, so that you need to know some way that in fact they did select something. Okay, and if it's changed from the default value of choose state, then you know they actually really did select something. Another alternative to this, might make sense in your application, is that you pick a state, city, and population by default, okay, as a starting point, and then you force them to go back and change it, to find what it is they're interested in. Okay, that works too. In that case, you don't need the dummy value. Okay, so then the city list, you would do the same thing, because it's, again, multiple levels. Excuse me. So here is a form that has these things on it. The top is the state, and the select item by default is going to be that dummy value, and then the value is actually a map. That's what you'll see on the other side, which is the list of states of the United States. And basically what it's saying is that when they in fact do choose something, then try to render the city list and the population, okay? Then that's the first menu, and then there's the city menu, which is of course based upon the state menu, and one of the things, now if you think about this, you don't want them picking city values if they haven't picked the state value. Okay, so basically what you do is you start out with the city being disabled, okay, or grayed out. And the way that you do that is by using the disabled attribute. If it says disabled, then it will be grayed out. They can see it, but they can't pick it. So that's also something you have to think about. If in fact they can choose a city, then render the population, which is the value of that city in that state. Okay, and all this is going to do is pull it out of a map. But this might be a perfect thing to put into an application scope bean, for example, which you actually could update without taking the site down, but would be global to everybody for reading purposes. Okay, so you got the basic idea? So there's the reference to the city list, and then the population is down there. So that's what you're attempting to render. So on the server side, the city list is going to be disabled. So that's an example of using the values on the server side as means to determine what gets rendered or what gets executed. Okay, let's see. So, and here just is the, you'll see that the cities, for example, are a map. Because usually, don't forget in your, in these widgets which allow you to pick from things, typically there are two values. There's the value that the person sees in the list that's visible, and then there's the value that gets returned if they pick it. Okay, so if it's a list of languages, for example, you might have them saying, English, Arabic, Farsi, Italian, Japanese, whatever. But what gets returned to you on the server side might be the two-letter country code, like EN, AR, JA, whatever. Okay, and that's actually what you would work with, which is more natural. It could be the same thing if you want, but. So here's the state info. This is simply a way of giving us the data. Where that actually comes from, as I said, this might be, since this is fairly static, it gets updated every so often, so it might make sense to make this kind of thing an application scoped bean, which would actually allow you to update it while the system is up. Otherwise, if it weren't, you might well have to take the system offline in order to update the population list, which may not be a good idea. Because it is basically static, but it gets updated sometime, once in a while. Okay, so these are just utility classes that are giving us access to the states and the cities and the populations. Okay? I'll let you look at that. So the result would be something like this. Here would be, somewhere on your page, you would see something like this. It would say choose state. Now you notice, it may be a little hard to see, but the choose city is grayed out. Okay, so they actually can't choose a city until they choose a state. So once they choose a state, then the city is undisabled. Okay, so it now becomes pickable, and then it allows you to choose the state, which then would allow you to choose the city. You notice here it's not disabled anymore. That will take you to the list of cities, okay, from which they can pick one of the lists cities from the menu, and that would then update that output text field, which happens to be right below it in this case, with the particular population. So, and then this is, as I said, is all done in Ajax. So this is actually something that is very relevant because this kind of thing with these hierarchical choosing menus happens all the time. Okay. So the Event, here's another piece. This will getting close to wrapping this up, just to finish it off. This example of a temperature converter on the fly. So what the idea here is we want to allow the user to type in a temperature in Fahrenheit. As the value is being entered, this shows you how Ajax really is working without the full page updates. The corresponding values in these two other fields, one called Celsius and one called Kelvin, two other temperature scales, are updated and displayed. So the idea here is you have a temperature field that's being asked for. In this case, we're doing it on key up. You could do it on blur, which means this would wait until they left the field. Okay. However, in this case, to really show you it working, it does it on every keystroke. Okay. So in this case, for an input text, key up is not the default action. All right, blur is probably the default action, and so you have to specify it. And then the two output fields are picked, and those are the ones that will be updated. So the temperature is passed. Is passed on every single request. So we don't have to keep it around like we did for the other thing with the cities and states. So here, on key up, render the other two things, and they're going to the temp converter .Fahrenheit will get called first, and then based upon that, the other two are going to be rendered. So there's how the thing happens in terms of sequence. Okay, the first one will be updated, and then the get will happen from the second, the things that are rendered with the new values in it. So again, it's just got the two Celsius and Kelvin values. Here's the thing that actually updates those values. The C for Celsius, excuse me, and the K for Kelvin. And so, assuming it can actually do the proper updating, then it will come back with the current updated values for each of those conversions based upon whatever you typed in thus far. So what you would see, again, this is more interesting if you can actually interact with it, because you would see it happening. But here, you notice there's nothing there, so there's no output values yet. If you start to type in, well, in this case, just to show you that you're catching the error, it will return invalid, so don't forget you should always try to catch errors, keep people from making them in the first place, but then catch them and then give them some way of fixing it. Those are critical design ideas. So if you start to, however, now this is on key up, these actions. So every time you type in a number and let go, it's actually going to do the conversion. Okay? So the first time if you type in a 2, you get those two output values. The 2 in Fahrenheit is below 0 in Celsius or centigrade. If you type a 1, now it's 21 degrees Fahrenheit, and those are, of course, higher. If you say 212, that's boiling water, which is 100 in Celsius, and 373 in Kelvin. So you see what's happening there. Okay? So that's another example of how you get these effects to work using Ajax. The last thing is this on event. What this does is it gives you a hook into the actual Ajax call itself. Now you remember I showed you 2 times ago, I showed you some vanilla JavaScript that showed you exactly what was happening underneath with Ajax, which nowadays you don't have to care about because it's hidden by other libraries like the JSF.js library here, or by jQuery, which also hides all of the details. But if for some reason you wanted to be able to monitor the Ajax call, remember what happens, it has a beginning and a middle and an end. And you can say this is starting, and then it's processing, and then it's completed. Now, where would that be useful? Well, it's useful when you have what you would consider long-running events. not everything is instantaneous, right, on the web. Both because some processing may take a while because there's a lot of computation that's involved, or it has to access a lot of different sources, but not everything is instantaneously going to come back to you. So what do you do with that? Well, you should let your users know. Again, remember, this is another one of those important ideas, feedback. You do never want to let people guess as to what the heck is going on. If you can tell them, I'm working on it, please wait, or something, that is far superior than having them go, click and bang on their keyboards, wondering what the heck is going on. So that's the example I'll show you here, is how you might do this using onEvent. Okay? So the idea here is the function that you write this little function. It's especially formatted in the sense that they almost always look the same or very similar. But what you do with it is completely up to you. Basically, you're going to write this little function, and then it's going to get called, and then as part of that, you can trap whether the thing is, the call has just been submitted and is waiting. You can trap whether the call has completed and then do something else using this. In this case, you would if you called this thing blah, and you would pass this thing called data, what you call it is irrelevant as long as you're consistent about using that name. So there are fields or properties associated with that thing automatically for you. Status is one. Status is either begin, complete, or success. Okay? Those are hard-coded terms that you look for. The source property would be the .source. That's the event that triggered this Ajax request, and then you'd actually have access to the response codes, etc., and any XML that comes back too. So here's a reason you might want to do this kind of thing. Is let's say you have an operation on the server side which is particularly slow, and it's going to be slow. Maybe you want to display an animated GIF or something like that, and a message, okay, that says after the request is sent but before it's finished. And then of course you want to hide it when it's finished. Okay, so this is a way of giving them feedback. You can, if you need an animated GIF, ones that the little circles going around, the stars turning, the little progress bars going back and forth, all of those things that you see on websites. If you go to this site, ajaxload.info, you can make one, and then they will create it, and you can download it, and then you can use it to your heart's content. So assume that we did that, and we've got some little rotating ball or something like that that shows that says to somebody something is happening. Okay, so basically what happens is you are going to make sure it's hidden initially. Makes sense. When the request begins, you change the display to inline. Inline makes it, or block, I guess, would do the same thing, makes it visible. And basically what you're looking for is you're looking for the begin status to come available. When the request finishes, then you're going to make the display none, which is going to make it invisible again. And then you're going to be looking for the success status, okay? There is another version of this which is kind of wraps all of this stuff up for you, though it might not suit you if you have multiple things going on, but it might be easier to get the same effect. Ajax status actually has wrapped a lot of this up for you, but I just wanted you to see exactly what's going on under it. So somewhere you have to write that little function. So let's say in this example we have a utils.js that we wrote, and in there is the function that's going to do this onEvent handling. Okay, So here, that function is called show working indicator. And for whatever reason, we're expecting this to be slow, which is why we're doing this here. Okay? Matter of fact, we'll purposely slow it down so it actually works. So here is the working indicator. This is the actual thing itself, the icon. And there's a piece of text that goes along with it that says, working, please wait. And initially it's invisible, display none, but it has to be in there somewhere on your page. And so here is the function that would be embedded in your JavaScript script, show working indicator. And as I said, a lot of this is boilerplate stuff, so you would simply look up examples of this, of how this is done, and then you could use it. So this is actually broken into two functions. One is the one that gets called by onEvent, and that calls another function, which is a more shareable function because it doesn't refer to a specific thing. It's actually taking a pair of IDs so that it's a generic function. The first one, of course, is that one. That particular one is the top one is hooked into a particular ID. So essentially, what this is doing is, if you look down here for the status, it's looking for status begin. Then it's going to call this thing and then show the element, which makes sense. So in other words, start it up, show it. If it's complete, then it's going to hide it, and it'll essentially go away. So these are the other calls here. The JavaScript that actually makes that happen then. So here we've artificially slowed this down. So we put in a 5-second delay just to show this happening. And what you would see is if somebody, if you look back to what the page looks like, they would type in a customer ID and a password. They would say show current balance. And then what you would see is something like this. Whoops, what happened to my, oh, there it is. They would see something, and I got that a little backwards. They would see something like that, loading data from server, and what you can't see is the little icon that's in front of it is actually a little circle, it's actually moving while it's doing it to reinforce that something's happening. And then as soon as the success status happens, then you clear it and give them their output. So that's the basic idea. So I just wanted to give you a couple of real examples to see how this sort of thing works, because it can make the responsiveness of your application much better, and it's really the way things are done nowadays. And it's kind of what people expect. So this is the sort of the marriage between that Ajax, those concepts and tools, along with the JSF that you now know. Okay? So, okay, any questions? No? All right. Okay, let's see. Where's the other one? No? Okay, so hang on here for a second.